Marvelous. No, seriously, this is a good-looking group. I mean, I don't know if you look around like I look around every Sunday, and we're an attractive bunch. I mean, I know there's a few of you that are a little rough around the edges. You could stand a little work, pay a little more attention to a few things. But for the most part, I mean, we're not so bad. We're a pretty attractive group, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing because it has been proven that attractive people are more successful. No, I think we know this is true. I think we have this sense that if you are beautiful, or if you are handsome, or if you are considered attractive, that people pay more attention to you. People sort of treat you differently, that there is a beauty privilege in our culture. In fact, the study of the relationship between beauty and economics is called pulchronomics. And one of the leading students of pulchronomics is a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. His name is Dr. Daniel Hammermesh. And in 2013, he published a book called Beauty Pays: Why Attractive People Are More Successful. He spent a number of years researching the economics of being attractive and beauty. And what he found was that people who are considered more attractive over the course of their lifetime will earn 3 to 4% more than the average looking person. In fact, he saw surveys indicated that people who are considered attractive will earn 12 to 13% more over the course of their lifetime than people who are considered unattractive or looks challenged. Now, we know this is true. I mean, he said that there is evidence that people who are considered more attractive get hired more easily. They get promoted more quickly. That many of the percentages of senior officers in large corporations are people who are identified as attractive compared to those who are unattractive. He even saw evidence that attractive people find getting loans easier at a better rate. I think we understand the reality of the culture that we live in. The sea that we are swimming in is a sea that values beauty and reacts differently to those who are attractive versus those who are unattractive. But the real problem is not just how we see others and how others see us based simply on how attractive we appear. It's how we see ourselves. Our body image has a lot to do with how we feel about our own value and our own significance. I researched body image during the week this week, and I read a number of interesting studies, and I found a few shocking statistics. Perhaps the most shocking one was that national surveys on multiple levels, from the American Psychological Association to Psychology Today, all yielded the same result. 90% of all women in America are, in one way or another, unsatisfied with their bodies. The average was 91% of all women are dissatisfied with their bodies. This compares to 48% of all men. No duh. Explains plumber's cracks pretty easily, doesn't it? But the shocking statistic is that sense of body dissatisfaction is plaguing our society, particularly women in our society, and they're finding that it affects women at a younger and younger age. Another shocking statistic that I saw said that 62% of all young girls aged 12 or 13 were dissatisfied with their bodies at 12 and 13 years old. And it's not just body dissatisfaction, it's body distortion. In the worst cases, it's called body dysmorphia. They found in a national survey that of women who were identified as extremely underweight, that means 10 pounds below their ideal or described perfect weight, they found that 40% of the women who were identified as extremely underweight said they needed to lose weight. This is the restless culture that we live in. I think all of us are very familiar with that dissatisfaction, with that restlessness when we look in the mirror, and that evaluation that we make of ourselves and how easily we project that onto those around us. This is the restless world that we live in. It is the restless sea that we are swimming in. A couple of weeks ago, we began a conversation about wrestling with our restless hearts. Is there anything we can do to find peace and contentment in a world that actually encourages that restlessness? I suggested that we walk for a while with one of the most restless people who ever lived. His name is Saul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul. And we look at some of the letters that he left us as he wrestled with his own restlessness, and we began searching for contentment and solutions in that restless world. I want to thank Pastor Aaron for filling in for me last week. Can you applaud for Pastor Aaron? He did me a great service last week on Friday. I had found out that my mother had died, and I needed to go be with my family, and so I asked Aaron to fill in, and it's very comforting to me to know that we have such gifted men and women who serve here, that they can step up and really fill in admirably. So I appreciate that. But today I want to turn our attention back to that conversation about restlessness by focusing on a very difficult subject, a very delicate subject, the restlessness that we feel about our own bodies. And what do we do about it? Does our faith even begin to help us find a place of contentment with our physical bodies? But before we press into this delicate subject, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to lift us up, to lift our heads above the flood, that we might find a measure of strength and contentment in the people that you have made us and the bodies you have given us. Pray that for myself and for my family, for all of us here, for I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. This obsession with physical appearance is not a new thing. It just isn't. It's part of the human condition. It is how humanity has evolved. Evolutionary biology identifies that attractional reality, because as far back as humanity goes, choices were made based on appearance as to whether a person would perhaps be a worthy mate or whether they were a friend or foe, whether or not they were a formidable or a weaker adversary. And so that tens of thousands of generations of development, it should not surprise us that we cannot help ourselves but notice the superficial, the physical appearance of everyone we meet. We're programmed to be that way. It is in our DNA. This is nothing new. In fact, 2,500 years ago, the Greek culture was obsessed with physical perfection. Their obsession with physical perfection is demonstrated in their art and in their philosophy, even in their theology. It was all over their culture, even in their architecture. It was the Greeks who, 2,500 years ago, came up with a way to celebrate physical perfection. They called it the Olympic Games. It was the first time in human history that a community of people organized a contest that didn't involve killing one another, as a proof, as a celebration of physical superiority, of physical perfection. And it was part of the Greek culture to idealize the perfect human form. It was in 51 AD that the Apostle Paul was journeying through the Greek peninsula. He found his way to Athens, and then a few months later found his way to the Greek city of Corinth. The Greek city of Corinth is located on an isthmus between the northern section of Greece and the largest islands of the Greek archipelago in the south. And the city of Corinth was not far from the city of Marathon. If you're familiar with Greek history, in September of 490 BC, the Persian armada attempted to invade Greece. And even though they were highly outnumbered, the Greek army defeated the great Persian navy and the Persian armada in the Battle of Marathon. At the conclusion of the Battle of Marathon, when the victory was secured, the story goes that a young man named Phidippides ran from Marathon to Athens, a distance of 26 miles. He ran into the Areopagus where the leaders of Greece were gathered and screamed out the words, "Victory!" and then promptly died. In his honor, we run marathons all the time, which is one of the most ridiculous things you could ever come up with. But the city of Corinth was not far from Marathon. It was just southwest of Athens, and it was embedded in the Greek culture of celebrating the human form. In the spring of 56 AD, the Apostle Paul was in the Turkish city of Ephesus, and he received word from the 5-year-old church in Corinth that they were in chaos, that they were fighting with one another, they were being split up by preferences and divisions. The Greek philosophers, the agnostic theologians, and the Jewish converts were at one another's throat. And so Paul decided from Ephesus in April of 56 AD to write a letter to the Corinthian church. It's been preserved for us in our Bibles as the first letter to Corinthians. And it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that the Apostle Paul employs an athletic metaphor. He says, don't you know that when it comes to running in a race, all the runners run? No duh. But not all the runners get a prize. If you're going to run like a winner. Run as if you are seeking a prize. Everyone who enters into athletic competition or who enters into the stadia, who enters onto the field of contest, goes into strict training. And they do it to get a crown that will not last. But we are running a race. We are in a competition for a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run aimlessly, he says. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body. I make it my slave, so that once I have preached to others, I may not be disqualified from the prize. What Paul is doing here in his letter to the Corinthian church is he is integrating the physical and the spiritual. He's saying there is not a duality between that which is material and that which is spiritual. They come together in our bodies so that our physical activity is a spiritual activity. That what we do with our bodies matters to God. And so I come away from reading this passage with two encouragements. How God feels about our physical bodies. And the first one is how we care for our bodies matters to God. How we care for our physical bodies matters to God. Like, how do we take care of ourselves? How we take care of ourselves is a spiritual thing. Now, we have a tendency to make a mistake, and we identify caring for our physical bodies as improving our appearance, as making ourselves more popular, more attractive to others. And we get confused by that because we live in a culture that says that's why you should diet, that's why you should exercise, that's why the diet industry is a $50 billion industry in our country. It's because we want to associate and be seen as more attractive. And so if we diet and exercise, it is to that end. Now, I used to believe in a thing I called hotmosis, What hotmosis is the theory that I had that if I hung out with hot people, I would by osmosis be considered hot. That's hotmosis. I had a theory. But that theory has been totally destroyed since I developed a friendship with a person who many of you would recognize, who is a riverbender here, and I'm pleased to call him a good friend. But in 2005, he was actually identified as the sexiest man alive. Exactly. I noticed that when we were having dinner or when we were walking around Austin, that people would give us the side eye and that people would lean in and talk to one another and point. And I realized that they weren't saying, "Who is that guy with Dave?" And I also realized that hotmosis doesn't work as people push their way by me to get to him. "Oh, you're a non-person, you're in my way." That hotmosis wasn't a thing. But the real bad news was, I realized that no matter how much I exercised, no matter how much I dieted, no matter how fit I was, this would never happen. And you see, that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul is not talking about caring for our bodies so that we can be more attractive. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24, he says, "Don't you realize that in a race, all the runners run, but not all of them get a prize? Run in such a way that you might run like a winner. Run in such a way that you might press toward the prize." What he's simply saying is, live your life, take care of your life as if it matters. Live your life, make the most of what you have been given. Do you realize the incredible biological machines that we're walking around in? Do you realize what they are? These are fantastic, almost supernatural biological engines that carry us through life. What is going on inside of our bodies every moment is literally spectacular. These bodies are amazing, even when they're damaged. Even when they're diseased, even when our bodies are disabled. Because we recognize the heroism of people who have physical limitations or who are fighting disease or who have disabilities, but they press in and they make the most of the physical capacities that they have been given. We consider them heroic because they are. Because it matters to God that we care for these bodies that we live in. It matters to God that we care for them. It is a spiritual activity. He says in verse 25, he says, everyone who enters into a competition goes into strict training. But they do it in order to gain a crown that doesn't last. And literally the award at the Olympic ceremonies 2,000 years ago was a wreath of leaves and flowers and vines. And it would last only a few days. You couldn't preserve it for any length of time because it was a living crown. And Paul says, no, you don't understand. Caring for our own bodies is a spiritual stewardship. It is a stewardship of the eternal. That it matters to God how we care for our bodies. We understand this about all of our assets, don't we? If we saw a person with great talent who never took advantage of that talent, we would criticize them for being a poor steward of their abilities. A person of great wealth who hoards it, who isn't generous, who doesn't bless others as they have been blessed, we say you're being a poor steward of the wealth that you have. Our bodies are a stewardship, no different than our time or our talent or our treasure. And we should make the most of them for the time that we have. Because in this world, everything is pressing against us. It is a struggle from start to finish. From the day that we are born, as our bodies grow and mature and change. Do any of you remember puberty? Was puberty the nightmare that it was for me? There were 3 months in between 9th and 10th grade where I grew 6 inches. Your body forgets how to talk to itself during that time. I couldn't walk up and down flights of stairs. You get into young adulthood and you're saying, how come I'm not as vigorous as I used to be? And as we age, we realize that we're starting to get frayed around the edges. I walked with my mother for the last few years through Parkinson's disease. And there was a sense last Thursday when she died that I was thankful that her struggle was over. I was thankful that she had been my mom. I was thankful that she poured her life into me and her values into me. But I was thankful that her heart gave out and set her free. With the time that we have, because it is short. We are candles in the wind. We are grass in the field. It matters to God that we take care of these physical bodies. The second thing that I see in Paul's integration of the physical and the spiritual is not just that it matters to God how we care for our bodies. It also matters to God how we use our physical bodies. See, the church has had this wrong for 2,000 years. I'm convinced that early on in the formation of the church integrated Platonic philosophy into its morality. The writings of Plato were philosophical musings about the difference between the material and the spiritual. And Plato argued for a dualism to the extent where all that mattered was the spiritual, was the immaterial. The material was we're just a meat sack or a skin-covered bag of chemicals. And so the material didn't matter. And the church, the early church, saw something in that and became an institution that elevated the idea that the physical doesn't matter. And it led to the practice of monasticism and celibacy and all these other extreme practices that we mistake as spiritual. But they're not good theology, they're Platonic philosophy. Paul has an integrated view, and he knows that what he does with his body, how he uses his body, is a spiritual thing. I think we know this is true, don't we? I mean, I'm reminded of this all the time. In fact, I was graphically reminded of this a few years ago. And I want to share with you a story. And some of you are going to get the point of this story. And because you do, this may be your last Sunday at Riverbend Church. And it's a story about which I'm not particularly proud. And when I told my wife I was going to share this story, she gasped. But it's a true story. My wife and I, the first 10 years we lived in Austin, in fact, until last year, we lived downtown. We love living downtown. Downtown is cool. I mean, we're empty nesters, and I thought, we'll just get a little condo downtown, and then our kids can't move back in. It was genius. Plus, we love living downtown because you can walk everywhere. You walk everywhere downtown, and Friday nights were our date night. And what we would do is we'd get home, and she'd get home from school, I'd get home from church, and we would go out, and we would go to any one of the great restaurants downtown. Thank you, Larry Foles. Or we'd go to the Alamo Ritz, or we'd go to Violet Crown, or we just walk around downtown. And over the years, our 3 daughters, who are now all in their 30s, immigrated to Austin, and they all live near downtown. So what started happening was we would begin our date nights by meeting our daughters for drinks. And over time, my daughters made friends with the manager of a bar down on dirty 6th Street. I mean, it is the diviest bar on 6th Street. And the manager has become a family friend. In fact, he sent his son to our preschool here. So we would start our Friday night date nights by meeting my daughters for drinks at this bar. And the bartender would greet us. It was kind of like a gothic, kind of creepy Cheers, where I would walk in and he would go, "Oh, Doc Dave!" And he would hug me, and he'd already have a drink for me. And there was one particular Friday when we got there, all of our daughters were there, a group of about 10 or 15 of our daughters' friends were there. We were at the bar, and I hadn't eaten anything all day. Yeah, ooh. And I was thirsty. And I was handed my usual, and I drank it and continued the conversation, and another one appeared, and I drank it. And about the time I finished the second drink, I realized it was time for us to go, and when I stood up, I realized I was not passing a field sobriety test. Now, we were only 4 blocks from our home. So I said, baby, we are not going to dinner. I'm going straight home. So I leaned on my wife, literally, and we walked out, and we walked down Red River, because Red River went right to our house, at the end of Red River. And we got to Red River and 5th Street. The Hilton Hotel is there. And as we were standing there, I was literally leaning on the light pole when the duck boat drove up. Do you know what the duck boat is here in Austin? The duck boat is a tour boat, and people get in the duck boat there at 5th and Red River behind the Hilton Hotel. And the duck boat takes people on a tour all around Austin. And while they're going on the tour, they're given these little duck whistles that go quack, quack, quack. And the driver is their guide. So he's narrating the story of Austin as they're driving around. Now the duck boat pulls up to 5th and Red River just as the light changes, and the duck boat stops. And I hear among the quack, 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 the guide, the driver, say, ladies and gentlemen, if you look down to your left, you will see the pastor of Riverbend Church, Dave Haney. Exactly. So he said, hey, everybody say hello to Pastor Haney and his wife. So we would have been fine if they had just kept going, but the light was red. We had to walk across the street in front of them. So I'm leaning on my wife going, hey, everybody, hope you're from out of town. And we went straight home. Now, there may be a couple of you here who get the point, because you're not coming back. Because you're saying, I'm not going to associate with a community where one of their spiritual leaders would allow themselves to be drunk in public. You connect those dots. And we all do. If you don't believe me that we connect those dots, ask a practicing Catholic. If the behavior of a fraction of the godly priesthood, where they used their bodies for evil, did not invalidate and undermine their faith. We know that there's a connection there, and so does Paul. You see, when Paul was writing to the Corinthian church, the church was in chaos. They were fighting with one another. In fact, they had decided that Paul should have no voice in that church, that he should have no authority. And as part of his letter to the Corinthian church, he was saying, hey, you need to listen to me. And one of the reasons that he says he has spiritual authority and spiritual integrity is what he says in 1 Corinthians 9, 26 and 27. He said, because it matters to God that I care for my body, because it matters to God how I use my body, I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. I do not live my life recklessly, carelessly, thoughtlessly. No, I make intentional decisions about how I will use my body. He says, I strike a blow to my body. In fact, I make it my slave. I discipline myself. I make sacrifices so that you will know the validity of the message that I am giving you. So that my preaching, once I have preached to you, once I have shown you my faith, it won't be invalidated by my actions. He's connecting the dots, you see. He's connecting the dots between our spiritual lives and our physical lives. And the church has had this wrong for 2,000 years. Because in the adoption of the Platonic duality, we have unintentionally advocated for the abuse of our bodies, for the neglecting of it, as long as our soul is pure, as long as our heart is right. That's all we're concerned about. Is the spirit, is the spiritual side, not the physical side. And that's wrong. Because how we use our bodies is ultimately a spiritual stewardship. It matters to God how we use them. It matters to God how we take care of them. And we live in a flood that encourages that dissatisfaction, that restlessness. Of all of the statistics that I read, perhaps the most frightening statistic I saw was the statistic that said that 58% of all women said they would be willing to trade 5 years of their life to live at their ideal weight. I asked my wife, I said, is this true? She said, I think the number is low. This is the world that we live in, and I raised 3 daughters in it. And that whole time I was very conscious that the world that they were entering into would measure their value strictly by their appearance. And I tried to do everything I could to show them how beautiful they were, how beautiful they are, beyond their physical appearance, how important they are, how valuable they are. And God is not a different father than me. I know this doesn't lift us out of the flood. It's naive of me to think that by understanding that how we care for our bodies matters to God and how we use our bodies matters to God, that might lift us out of the flood. I'm not naive enough to think that you can swim without getting wet. I just want us not to drown in it. I just hope you can lift your head above water and swim in a good direction. And it's hard. I know it's hard. I mean, when Dan Hammermesh published his book, Beauty Pays, people kind of went, oh my, we didn't know that was true, but of course they did. I mean, there were some studies that took place that are interesting in the watershed of Hammermesh's book. Two that I found very interesting. The first one, they gave people headshots of NFL quarterbacks. And they did this random survey where they asked people to rate these faces of these NFL quarterbacks based on how attractive they were. And you know what they found? They found that the quarterbacks who were ranked as attractive versus the quarterbacks who were rated unattractive or average attractive, those who were ranked as attractive earned 12% more in their careers than the unattractive ones. These are NFL quarterbacks. Another study that came out of the Hammermesh book was a study that economics professors conducted. University professors of economics. Not exactly a stunningly attractive profile. Let's just put it that way. And they asked their students to rate their professors in degrees of hotness, anonymously online, to give their professors between 1 and 5 chilies representing hotness. And the students obliged and gave them feedback, and at the end of the year, they found that those professors who had been rated 5 chilies made 6% more on average than those who had rated 1 or 2 chilies among economics professors. But I didn't need the study of pluchronomics to tell me that this was the world we lived in. I didn't need surveys. I didn't need to study about body image to know that we live in a restless world. That all of us are wrestling with the dissatisfaction and the frustration with these bodies. But as I look around this room today, I can tell you of the beauty that I see. And I can honestly tell you, you look marvelous.